Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. Today I want to share with you one of my favorite episodes, a conversation only those who followed Upstream since the beginning will have heard. As we look for signs of God's nature in His creation, few areas are as important as the natural sciences. But these are also an area where Christians for a long time now have felt excluded. Oxford biologist Richard Dawkins wrote in his book, River Out of Eden, that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Dawkins was speaking of biology in this case, but he could certainly say, as many outspoken atheists and materialists have over the years, that nothing about our bodies, our planet, or our universe indicates the existence of God. With a line like this, so-called new atheists have placed themselves at the crest of a scientific wave they say has conquered medieval superstition, has elevated humankind above our dark and ignorant past, and has rendered belief in God not so much impossible as just unnecessary. But is this telling of the scientific story, both historical and modern, an accurate telling? Were science and faith really at war from the beginning? And are they at war now? Well, atheist writers have their answer, but the guest whose conversation I want to share with you today has a very different one. I'm pleased to welcome to the show Dr. Stephen Meyer. Dr. Meyer received his PhD in the philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge. He's a former geophysicist and college professor who now directs the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller Darwins Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design, and Signature in the Cell before that. Subtitle of that is DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. His latest is called The Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 scientific discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. And that's what we want to talk about today. Dr. Meyer, welcome to Upstream.
Thanks for having me on, Shane. And what a provocative introduction.
I hope it provokes a good discussion. It's only effective if it does that. Yeah. Well, let's start not with Richard Dawkins, but with 19th century French scholar named Pierre-Simon Laplace. And there's this apocryphal remark you record in the book that he supposedly made to Napoleon Bonaparte after presenting him a copy of his work. And Napoleon supposedly asked, well, where's God in this? And Laplace said, I had no need of that hypothesis, or at least that's the way the story goes. Was he right? Has science rendered the God hypothesis moot? How accurate is that attitude?
Well, the story is, as you mentioned, apocryphal. The first record of it came from British historian William Herschel much later, and there was no record of that exact quotation, but it did seem to capture the spirit of Laplace's work and the tenor of his basic conversation with Napoleon. And I think whatever the truth was about that particular conversation, the 19th century was in fact a time when scientists began to extricate themselves from the theistic moorings of modern science that had been so crucial to the rise of modern science at the beginning of modern science during the period that historians call the scientific revolution from roughly 1500 to 1750, or stretching back into the late Catholic Middle Ages. I think the roots of the scientific revolution go back to developments in philosophy at Oxford and Paris University in the 1300s. So this was a period of science arose in a decidedly Christian milieu or context for very specifically Judeo-Christian reasons. During this period of time, Christian scholars were rediscovering the Hebrew Bible. They used theological metaphors to describe their enterprise. They were looking for laws of nature, which they thought were a reflection of a divine lawgiver. They thought that nature was intelligible because it had been made by a rational creator who had also given us rationality in order to understand the design and the order that the creator had built into nature. They believed that nature was a book that revealed the mind of the creator every bit as much as the book of scripture. So this was the theistic foundation of modern science. But during the 19th century, with Laplace, with some of the great geologists, and certainly Charles Darwin and his acolytes, Thomas Henry Huxley, Ernst Haeckel in Germany, a much more decidedly materialistic approach to the natural sciences arose, where scientists no longer saw evidence of design as Newton did, as Boyle did, as Kepler did, but instead thought that nature had within it the self-organizing properties to arrange itself into all the complex structures that we see in the world, from the solar system to new forms of life to even human life and even the origin of the very first life. So by the end of the 19th century, there was a kind of seamless materialistic narrative or story that could be told about where everything came from that did have no need of that design or God hypothesis as a necessary explanatory framework for doing science.
The story you're telling here is very unfamiliar to many people who've been taught this alternative story that there's been a conflict between science and faith since the inception of modern science. And the first part of your book is really dedicated to debunking that in a rigorous historical way. Not only do you tell the stories of, the major players in the scientific revolution, but you offer an explanation of the kind of theological underpinnings of science, the assumptions that had to be made initially for modern, science as we know it to emerge, and explain the fact why science emerged in the West and in no other advanced civilization.
This is a huge question for historians of science. So sometimes it's thought of as the why then, why there question. What accounts for the Greeks were an intellectual culture. They were very philosophical. Some of them studied nature, but the systematic methods of studying nature that arose during the period of the scientific revolution that involved things like isolating variables, attributing causality, describing lawful order with mathematics. The whole concept of the laws of nature was something that was unique to this innovative period of time. And historians have attributed much of the source of this innovation in the approach to studying nature as a result of underlying theological presuppositions. First, that nature was orderly, but the Greeks also believed that nature was orderly, but they believed that the order was a consequence of an inherent logic that was, in a sense, inviolable and self-evident to anyone who was also logical. In the Christian West, there was a different idea as they were rediscovering the doctrine of creation in the Hebrew Bible. And that was the idea of an impressed order, that order was impressed on the creation by the mind of God, and that since God was entirely free, he could have chosen many different kinds of order, many different ways of ordering nature. Newton described an inverse square law for gravitation. It might well have been an inverse cube law or a linear relationship between the variables. To find out what type of order was there, one needed to go and look. You couldn't just do armchair philosophizing as the Greeks had done. And one thing that historians of science point to that was very obscure, but it was a decree in 1277 by a pope who condemned what is called necessarian theology, the idea that God must have worked in a particular way. Right. The Greeks thought that the most perfect form of motion was a circle, so therefore the planets must be moving in circular orbits. Kepler discovered they were ellipses, but he did that by looking and seeing. So this idea of a contingent creation, a creation that was contingent on the mind of God, that required us to go look and see, was one of the things that gave rise to a specifically empirical approach to science and a very systematic way of evaluating the evidence. And there's a lot more. The theological presuppositions that are crucial to the rise of modern science are actually quite numerous, and they do come straight out of that Judeo-Christian context.
One other example I've heard of such a presupposition is that we are created in the image of God and therefore have the ability innately to think God's thoughts after him, as Newton would have put it. Actually,
it's a famous quote from Kepler, but you're exactly right. The idea of intelligibility was
key. I had the wrong physicist.
No, it's okay. It's good, really good. I mean, you're on top of this. But there was a converse assumption as well, and that is that humans are made in the image of God, and therefore we're capable of understanding the rationality, the order, the design that's put into nature, because we've been endowed with rationality by our Creator. But especially during the period of the Reformation, there was a reaffirmation of the fallenness of human beings, and that our rebellion against God had affected what Alvin Plantinga calls our noetic capabilities, that we're also capable of flights of fancy, jumping to conclusions, cherry picking the data. And therefore, we have to carefully test our ideas against nature itself. We have to go and look and see again. So these two theological propositions, that nature was ordered by a mind other than our own, and that our minds were capable of understanding that, but also fallible, led to a very empirical approach to science that emphasized testability and evaluation against the evidence.
You bring scientist after scientist in the early parts of the scientific revolution, of its birth as a discipline, and back then they called them natural philosophers, to the, witness stand, as it were, to testify about their motivation, their theistic drive to understand God's world. And some of the things they say are just beautiful and poetic. And yet, by the time Laplace comes along, we've got this different paradigm that's beginning to take shape. What happened there? How did science go from a fundamentally pro-theism enterprise to one that's so radically anti-theism that it says God's unnecessary?
Well, it's a big story, and the shift takes place gradually. I think it begins with developments in Enlightenment philosophy during the 18th century. And those developments start to affect science during the 19th century. I mean, there's still great theistic scientists during the 19th century. James Clerk Maxwell, the great Scottish physicist, was a devout Christian. And when I was in Cambridge as a PhD student, my department was right next door to the famous Cavendish Laboratory. And on the great door of the Cavendish Laboratory, Maxwell had inscribed the words of the Psalm 111, "Great are the works of the Lord, sought out by all who take pleasure therein." And this was his understanding of the motivation for doing natural science. But in general, there was a shift towards a much more materialistic framework for understanding science. And a big part of that was a consequence of the theories of origins that scientists were developing during the 19th century that had no need of an intelligent designing agent or God as an explanatory principle. During the scientific revolution, it was not only the case that the early scientists brought to bear theistic presuppositions in the way they framed the scientific enterprise, but they also believed they were seeing evidence of design as they did their science. Newton made very sophisticated and compelling design arguments, both in the General Scholium to the Principia, his theological epilogue to his great work about gravitation, and secondly, in the optics, where he argued that the design of the eye, the intricate design of the eye, revealed the activity of a designing agent, not only because of its own intricacy in design, the integrated complexity of the eye, but also in the way the eye anticipated the properties of light. This is a very subtle design argument, but very powerful. So during the 19th century, these types of arguments fell out of favor. And by the time you get to Darwin, he is attempting to explain the origin of new forms of life and the appearance of design that they manifest. He acknowledges the appearance of design, but he says that appearance can be produced by an undirected, unguided process, not the artificial selection of a human breeder or the intelligent selection or design of God, but rather the natural selection, nature winnowing variations according to their beneficial basis for survival. So he has a designer substitute mechanism called natural selection, acting on random variation, that allows him to explain the appearance of design without an actual designing intelligence. And so by the end of the 19th century, with Darwin's ideas kind of culminating this trend, you have a roughly seamless narrative from the origin of the solar system to the great geological features on planet Earth to the origin of new forms of life. And Darwin's ideas even get extended to explain the origin of the first life by figures like Haeckel and Huxley. And so by the end of the 19th century, it's true that the scientists feel they have no need of a design hypothesis and therefore no need of an intelligent designer and therefore no need of God as an explanation. And that attitude and set of presuppositions about science has kind of informed much of 20th century science. 20th century scientists have, as a rule, adopted a strictly naturalistic approach to explanation. And yet, and this is the story of the book, we've had three huge discoveries about the origin of the universe, about its finely tuned physical structure, and about the origin of life and the nature of life at its foundational level in molecular biology that I think point in the opposite direction. They point opposite to a materialistic world. They challenge a materialistic worldview and have implications that are supportive of not just even intelligent design, simpliciter, but a designing intelligence with the attributes that Jews and Christians have always ascribed to God.
This is what's so fascinating to me about your book, because it tells the story of how science kind of went off the rails into this scientific materialism philosophy. And you make this very impressive argument that science is coming back in the theistic direction, especially in the 20th century, that these discoveries have pulled it back in that direction, and that the rhetoric of the war between science and religion is now, looking increasingly ridiculous. I think the most interesting aspect is the implication of scientific hubris, where you have this early on this idea that we shouldn't be like the Greeks, right? We shouldn't play a name game with stuff. We can't just say bread nourishes because of its nutritive property. All you've done is, you've just named the effect and made it its own cause. You're just reasoning circularly. So that philosophy was kind of a dead end. And scientists said, no, we got to pursue the material causes. What is it that causes it on a physical level? But it seems like science went off the rails at the point where it says, hang on, we can push material causes all the way back to the origin of everything, and material causes are now omnipotent. And that was the attitude that took over. But these three discoveries, you think, really challenge that idea that science can explain everything, and that we even have to have this barrier between, science and the implications of theology or philosophy.
Or a theistic explanation.
Right.
And there's a couple things to say about that. First of all, this idea that there was a warfare between science and Christianity in particular, or theism or belief in God more generally, is an artifact of late 19th century historiography, as it's called, the study of the history of science.
Propaganda.
It was a kind of, there were a couple important books that were written that portrayed this. The one was called The History of the Warfare Between Science and Christianity. That kind of told the story. Now, that was a massively revisionist enterprise, and it wasn't consistent with what modern historians now know about the period of time in which the scientific revolution occurred. There was no warfare. It was exactly the opposite. It was, as John Lennox likes to say, I'm not embarrassed to be a Christian and a scientist because Christianity gave me my discipline. That's his line. In any case, that's one thing to say about it. But secondly, another thing to keep in mind is that there are different types of scientific endeavor. Some types of science is concerned with describing what nature does apparently on its own in a regular way. And I accept, as many Christians who work in the sciences accept, that natural entities have causal powers of their own. And underlying all that, we believe, many theists believe that God is sustaining and upholding the basic laws of nature. But it's perfectly legitimate to try to describe the orderly concourse of nature and to show what one part of nature may affect another, and to describe that with mathematics or as a basis of some chemical equation or whatever it is. And those types of scientific descriptions, theories, explanations can be properly, completely materialistic, because you're asking about how one part of matter is affecting another part of matter. But there's another part of science which is concerned with origins, which is the study of how things got here. We could call that roughly historical science. And there is a different context of inquiry. Instead of asking, what does nature ordinarily do on its own, that you're asking the question, where did nature come from in the first place?
Right.
And their creative intelligence might actually have played a significant role. And therefore, we need to be open to the possibility that perhaps the origin of life was produced solely by undirected material processes, chemical reactions from simpler chemicals in a prebiotic soup, but also perhaps creative intelligence played a role in, for example, generating the information in the molecules that's necessary for life to exist at all. And so in these crucial origins questions, which were the origins theories in the 19th century, were effectively what excluded God as an explanatory principle in science. I think now the discoveries that we've made that are relevant to understanding the origin of life, the origin of the fine-tuning of the universe, and the origin of the universe itself have theistic implications, or we could say, to explain the data relevant to those events, God is not only a possible explanatory hypothesis, but actually the best explanation of the evidence that we have collectively about those big events in the history of life and the universe.
Oh, I want to get to the three discoveries that you talk about in the book in just a second, but I'm so fascinated by this kind of ground rules game that's going on in science as we speak. So Dawkins says that our universe, has precisely the properties we should expect if there's no purpose or designer. Yet he and other scientific materialists seem totally unwilling to even test the God hypothesis. They rule it out of court from the beginning as an illegitimate pseudoscientific thing. And you're
doing a super perceptive observation, Shane, because there's a tension there, right? If you say that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if at bottom there's no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. That's the quote from Dawkins, right? What's implied there? Well, blind, pitiless indifference and no design, no purpose is just a shorthand way of referring to materialism, the worldview of scientific materialism that says matter and energy are the things from which everything else comes, and mind has played no role in the shaping of matter or its design in the history of life in the universe. So effectively what Dawkins is saying is that the materialistic worldview can be evaluated empirically. How? By looking at the universe to see if the properties that it has match those that you would expect if scientific materialism were true.
Right.
And I love that because he's basically making a strong claim and arguing that you can test metaphysical hypotheses or worldviews. But if that's true of materialism, the same thing ought to be true of theism. And in fact, the argument that I make in the book is that these three big discoveries, the first is that the universe had a beginning in time and space. The second is that the universe has been finely tuned from the very beginning or soon thereafter to allow for the possibility of life against all odds, exquisite levels of fine tuning, and that there is digital code or information, functional information present in the large biomacromolecules that make life possible. These are discoveries that you would never have expected on the basis of materialism. Brute matter does not produce digital code. Fine-tuning suggests a fine-tuner. Materialism denies any pre-existing mind prior to the origin of the universe. So fine-tuning isn't what you'd expect at all. And the materialists have long said that they think that the universe is eternal and self-existent. And the famous quote from Carl Sagan and later Neil deGrasse Tyson in the Cosmos series about the universe is all there is, all there ever was, and all there ever will be. The universe is the eternal self-existent thing rather than God in a materialistic worldview. And yet we have evidence that the material universe has not always been here, that it had a definite beginning. And so these are just discoveries. These three big discoveries are not expected. The materialistic worldview that Dawkins is promulgating. And one way you know that is the elaborate, what are called ad hoc or auxiliary hypotheses that materialists have had to come up with in order to explain these big three discoveries. We've had postulations of space alien designers by no less a person than Francis Crick and Richard Dawkins himself. The physicists are talking about multiverses that are causally disconnected and unverifiable, undetectable from our own as a way of explaining the fine-tuning. And in cosmology, Hawking came up with ideas about imaginary time and quantum wave functions as the explanation for the origin of the universe, which I show in the book. In fact, I show in the book that both the multiverse hypothesis and the quantum cosmological hypothesis, if true, have their own hidden theistic implications. So the point is that the materialists have had to resort to very convoluted explanations that involve multiple theoretical entities that cannot be verified or detected, as opposed to a simple, clear postulate that there was a transcendent intelligence that brought the universe into existence, fine-tuned it, and helped to create life.
It's kind of a jujitsu move you're doing where the longtime materialist trope has been to say, well, you can believe in God if you want, but he's not necessary because we've explained it all in material terms. But what you're doing is saying, hey, you guys have to come up with all these auxiliary theories. You can believe in a multiverse if you want, but it's much simpler, Occam's razor, to say, God is behind all this stuff. Let's zero in on the first discovery here. The universe had a beginning. So I don't think that it strikes many of my listeners immediately as an obviously pro-theistic thing or something that has massive theistic implications. Why is that the case?
Well, there's a great Princeton physicist who was looking for the cosmic background radiation, which was one of the indicators of the Big Bang. He didn't find it. His name was Robert Dicke. But two other guys in New Jersey did, Penzias and Wilson. But Dicke pointed out, he said that an infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of explaining the origin of matter at any finite time in the past. On the other hand, if the universe begins to exist, that suggests the need for a cause beyond the universe. It's an ancient cosmological argument that ran like this, the argument for God's existence. Whatever begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist, not known until the 1920s, 30s, and into our current century. Therefore, whatever begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe must have a cause. And since all causes are separate from themselves, the cause must be separate from the universe. It must transcend the domains of matter, space, time, and energy. And as you look at the competing possible causal explanations that are provided by competing metaphysical systems, materialism fails. Because materialism posits matter and energy as the cause of everything. In fact, it posits that matter and energy have been self-existent. So that's an eternal, that we now know that's not true or have good reason to doubt that. And moreover, to explain the origin of the universe in materialistic terms is inherently contradictory because it's matter and energy that come into existence at the beginning, before which there is presumably no matter and energy to do the causing. Now, there have been oscillating and cyclical models of the origin of the universe, but there are problems with those that also imply that there must have been a beginning, irrespective of whether we're in the middle of just one of many cycles. The cycles eventually damp out, and had we been around for an infinitely long period of time, we would have already reached a nullifying equilibrium. The ball would have stopped bouncing, and we wouldn't be in an expansion phase. But we are, and so therefore, we don't live in an infinitely old universe. In any case, the point is, materialism doesn't provide a good explanation, but theism does, because theism posits the existence of a powerful mind that exists independently of the universe. And that's exactly the profile of the cause that we need, something that's independent of matter, space, time, and energy, that's not bound by our time and space. God fits that causal profile and therefore provides a better explanation of the origin of the universe than does materialism, or for that matter, pantheism, the Eastern philosophy that makes God and matter coextensive, because in pantheism, there's no transcendence either.
The story you tell of the struggle to win acceptance for this theory that the universe actually had a beginning out of the jaws of this dominant theory of the steady state where matter and energy have always existed. It's fascinating. The resistance that you see physicists, even some of the greatest physicists in history and astronomers, putting up to this theory is amazing. Of course, the most famous is probably Einstein himself, who came up with the cosmological constant, which sort of jury-rigged his theory to make it look like the universe wasn't, expanding and didn't need to have a beginning. And he called it the greatest blunder of his career because...
Yeah, this is actually a fascinating story, Shane, because you've got the observational astronomers that are getting the first indications of a beginning, because what they're seeing is that the galaxies are expanding. They're receding. They're moving away from us.
Right.
And the indication of that came from the light coming from the galaxies. It was being stretched out. The wavelengths were longer than would have been expected had the objects in the night sky been at a constant distance from us. It's like the Doppler effect that we know about from physics class. If the train is receding, the pitch of the whistle goes, it becomes lower. The wavelengths of the sound are stretched out. Same thing was happening with the light. Longer wavelengths correspond to the red end of the visible spectrum of light. So the evidence was called the redshift evidence. And as the astronomers surveyed the night sky, they found that the light coming from distant galaxies was redshifted in all the quadrants of the night sky. And so this suggested an expanding universe that was moving outward in a roughly spherical manner, like a balloon being blown up. But if you back extrapolate from that and think about what the universe would have been like 1,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, 1,000,000,000 years ago, however far back you go, eventually the matter of the universe would have been condensed into a single point, marking the beginning of the expansion and arguably the beginning of the universe itself. Now, Einstein initially didn't know about this. He formulated a theory in 1915 called general relativity, which is the theory of gravity. And so on. There was a parallel track. You've got the observational astronomy and then the theoretical physics that's coming out of Einstein's new ideas about gravity. And according to Einstein, massive bodies actually curve the fabric of space and create sort of preferred lines of trajectory for any other body passing by a massive body. Now, that implied that if a dynamic universe, because if gravity were the only force operating in the universe, we would have already had a big crunch. Space would have been curved infinitely tightly, and we clearly don't live in such a universe. We live in a universe with empty space between massive bodies, between galaxies. So there must be, he argued, an anti-gravity force that's pushing outward. And he called that the cosmological constant. So far, so good. But what he did in addition to that was assign a very precise value for the cosmological constant. And in effect, he fine-tuned it so that the outward pushing force of the cosmological constant exactly balanced the inward pulling force of gravity, so he could portray the universe as in a state of equipoised stasis, a static universe. Problem with that is later theoretical physicists showed that even on just the straight up physics grounds, that wasn't stable. Very slight perturbations in matter or energy anywhere would cause either a recollapse or an expansion. But then secondly, the observational evidence from astronomy, which he didn't know about when he formulated the theory in his fine-tuning. And he learned about this in 1927 in a famous taxicab ride with the Belgian priest physicist, Georges Lemaitre. And Lemaitre told him about what Hubble and his colleague Humason out at Caltech were discovering. And later, Einstein went out, took a peek through the telescope. There's some famous 1931 newsreel footage where Einstein's looking through the telescope with Hubble in the background with his pipe. And 2 weeks later, he gives an interview to the New York Times and says that Hubble and Humason have established that the universe was not static. The universe must have had a beginning. And later he says that his gerrymandering the value of the cosmological constant was, as you say, the greatest blunder of his scientific career. And he acknowledged that initially that his resistance to the idea of an expanding universe outward from a beginning was that the ideas seemed to be based on Christian theology. It wasn't based on Christian theology, but it did oddly confirm the basic biblical premise that the universe had a beginning, the very first words of Genesis, after all.
So here we are in the 21st century after this time of well-resisted discovery that has demonstrated very compellingly that the universe had a beginning. It's not in a solid state. The second discovery that you point to is this idea that the universe is fine-tuned. We hear that phrasing a lot, particularly in apologetics. What does that mean, and why is it significant?
Well, the fine-tuning of the universe refers to the precise values and strengths of many of the physical parameters and forces, precise in relation to the requirements of life or requirements of a life-conducive universe. Physicists sometimes talk about our universe as a Goldilocks universe.
Right.
That cosmological constant, the force that's generating the expansion of the universe, is not too strong, not too weak. It falls within a precise strength or tolerance or limit that allows for a life-friendly universe. If the force were a bit stronger, by 1 part in 10 to the 90th is an accepted value, 10 to the 90th power, we'd have what's called a heat death of the universe. The universe would effectively blow apart and matter and energy would be so diffuse you couldn't get stable galaxies or rocky planets and things like that. On the other hand, if the force were a little bit lesser, if it weren't as strong, you'd have a recollapse. The gravitational force would overcome the cosmological constant and you'd get a big crunch into a giant black hole, neither of which conditions are friendly to life. And just to put that number in context, there are 10 to the 80th elementary particles in the entire universe. That's the best estimate we have. So to get the fine-tuning right by chance would be like blindfolding someone, sending them out in space, and having them look for one elementary particle. But not just in our universe, they'd have to actually search 10 billion other universes our size to be sure that they'd made a thorough search. In other words, getting this right by chance is absurd. It's astronomically improbable. And the fine-tuning of the cosmological constant is only one of a couple dozen of these fine-tuning parameters, many of which are independent from each other. The strength of gravitational force, the strength of electromagnetic force, the ratios between those two forces, the ratio between the strong nuclear force, which holds atoms together, and electromagnetic force is crucial for example, the ability for the universe to synthesize carbon, which turns out to be necessary. Highly abundant carbon is necessary for life in the universe. And on it goes. So there's many of these fine-tuning parameters. And when you have an ensemble of highly improbable parameters that exemplify a set of functional requirements, we call that fine-tuning. Also, in our experience, systems that have those two properties of an ensemble of improbable probabilities that exemplify a set of functional requirements or produce a functional outcome. Systems that have those properties are invariably intelligently designed. French recipes are finely tuned. Internal combustion engines are finely tuned. Electronics are finely tuned. The digital code is finely tuned. And all of them have in common a fine tuner. And so or a designer. And so Fred Hoyle, initially great scientific atheist, later came to a kind of proto-theistic view of things and was quoted as saying that the data we have, a common sense interpretation of the evidence, suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics and chemistry to make life possible. Fine-tuning suggests a fine-tuner.
Part of the power of the argument you're making here with respect to fine-tuning is that the claim has so long been made that science can explain everything we observe through material causes. But when you get to the very back of material itself, to the very back of the universe itself, and the question of where time and space and matter and energy came from, you can't posit material causes. Like you said, an effect can't explain itself. And when we get to the back, we find and have discovered that everything's majestically fine-tuned at levels of improbability that defy imagination. I mean, that's philosophically powerful, not just scientifically powerful. And I'm not really sure, how someone
it's a scientific evidence that underwrites a powerful philosophical argument for God's existence. And of course, we talked a bit earlier about the multiverse, but that has been the go-to alternative materialistic explanation. And it's probably
address that for us.
What's wrong with that? It may be that there's a multiverse, but if there is, it doesn't explain the fine-tuning. And here's the problem. If there are a billion other universes out there, but they're causally distinct from our own.
Right.
The mere existence of alternative universes doesn't affect anything in our universe if they're causally disconnected, if they're not interacting. And therefore, the existence of these other universes doesn't affect the probability of whatever it was that set the fine-tuning at the beginning. So
it's like a giant gambler's fallacy.
Yeah, exactly. So even if you have other universes, that by itself does not provide a probabilistic explanation for the origin of the universe. What you need is something like a common cause of all the universes that it provides some way of calculating the probability of getting one of the universes as opposed to another. And so in recognition of that, multiverse proponents have proposed universe generating mechanisms. And some of them are based on string theory. Others are based on something called inflationary cosmology. And in fact, you need both types of universe generating mechanisms because each one explains one part of the fine tuning, but not the other. And you need them both to explain the whole range of fine tuning phenomena. So it's massively convoluted in the Occam's razor sense of postulating multiple explanatory entities. Not only do you have to posit a virtual infinity of alternative universes, you have to posit these two different universe generating mechanisms, each of which imply the existence of other unobservable theoretical entities. It's really an elaborate hypothesis. But even more telling, even in theory, these universe generating mechanisms require prior fine tuning if they are to generate new universes. So the fine-tuning of the universe that was the thing that the multiverse was designed to explain is not actually ultimately explained. It's just pushed out of view. It's pushed back a generation to the fine-tuning of the universe-generating mechanisms that produce the universes, and they hope one lucky one that has the right fine-tuning parameters in our, somewhere, namely ours.
It seems like we're doing metaphysics at this point, though, even for scientists to be talking this way, because by definition, right, other universes that are causally independent from ours would be inaccessible to science.
Well, and I've never been comfortable with the strict demarcation between metaphysics and science, because scientists are making claims about reality, and metaphysics is the philosophical discipline that studies what is really real.
Right.
Now, if you want to call the multiverse a metaphysical hypothesis, or call philosophical naturalism a metaphysical hypothesis, or theism a metaphysical hypothesis, that's okay with me. I don't really care how we classify these things, and in fact, I'm quite happy to compare the explanatory power of competing worldviews or metaphysical hypotheses. That's what I do in the book. But many scientists have commented, well, gee, these multiverse hypotheses are positing things that are far removed from any possible observation. That, however, a general point is worth making, and that in science, that's often done. We often posit things we can't see in order to explain the things we can see. The question is, how simply can we explain what we see? Are we multiplying explanatory entities unnecessarily? Is there a simpler explanation that's being overlooked? And secondly, what about the explanatory power of the explanation that's proposed? If the explanation doesn't ultimately explain the thing it was designed to explain, it's lacking explanatory power. And I think that's the problem with the multiverse. It's very convoluted. I actually count about 10 different purely abstract theoretical postulates that have to be affirmed as part of the multiverse hypothesis. All the extra dimensions of space that come along with string theory, the inflaton field and inflationary cosmology, the inflaton shutoff energies, on and on it goes. It's a very elaborate explanation, as opposed to the single postulate of a transcendent intelligence. And indeed, a postulate that comports with our uniform and repeated experience, our ordinary experience, that finely tuned systems arise from intelligent agents. And given that the multiverse doesn't ultimately explain the fine-tuning, we really only have one known causal explanation for fine-tuning, and that is intelligence. So even if the multiverse is true, I think you still have a fine-tuning problem, and therefore I think you still have evidence of a designing intelligence that is necessary to explain both the fine-tuning and our life-conducive universe.
This really gets to the heart of it, Dr. Meyer. I don't want to give away the kind of secret of the book here prematurely to reviewers, but the idea that's coming across to me is you're challenging the ground rules of science. You're saying we don't necessarily have to have non-overlapping magisteria, that we can pursue in our investigations of material effects to causes that could, best explain them, even if those causes fall outside of the typical boundaries that we've set up for science. How do you, as a philosopher of science, see the progress and validity of that? And how would you defend changing the definition of science?
Well, I don't think we're actually changing the historic definition of science. Science comes from the root scientia, which just means knowledge. Right. So I think the object of someone who's interested in the natural world is to get to know it, and by whatever means are possible. And when we're talking about these origins questions, it is a logically possible hypothesis that the universe or the digital code in living systems or life itself was the product of a creative intelligence. And it's even logically possible that we might be able to tell from the effects that we're looking at. And so I think it's just important to follow the evidence where it leads to the best explanation and not limit our explanations to things that are strictly materialistic, because we might be missing the obviously best explanation. If you want to call a God hypothesis a metaphysical hypothesis, that's fair enough. But I think the theory of intelligent design, where we don't get into the question of the identity of the designer, is certainly, it bears all the same features of an historical scientific theory as its materialistic competitors. So I'm really not hung up about the definition. I want to know what's true, and I want to reason from the evidence to the best explanation, assuming that our best explanations are the ones that are most likely to be true.
Well, we've got a few minutes left here. I want to hit the last big discovery, and this is the one that you've obviously written about the most, and it's in the area of biology. One of the great historic arguments for God was looking at living things like William Paley did and saying they're intricate, they exhibit artistry, complexity, and purpose that is best explained by a designer, by an engineer who put them together and set them on their way. And this has kind of been the classic design argument. Of course, Darwin is and has been seen for a long time now as the silver bullet that takes that apart, or the universal acid, as I think it was.
Right, as Dennett says.
Yeah, Daniel Dennett said that. So give us the brief 30,000-foot sketch on why Darwin is not the silver bullet and why the arguments tend to be turning back in the theistic direction on biology.
And I think that's actually true. I think things are turning back and fairly rapidly. Darwin attempted to explain the appearance of design without an actual designing intelligence. This was the most philosophically significant implication of his work. And he explained some appearances of design, or things that had been thought to be the consequence of design in the 19th century, like minor modifications or adaptations to the environment. But the question is, did he explain all appearances of design? One appearance of design he didn't explain is the appearance of design we find in even the simplest living cells, because Darwin didn't attempt to explain the origin of the first life. He only attempted to explain how new forms of life arose from some pre-existing form, the origin of which he did not address. And so in the 19th century, it was, I think, possible to think that some undirected natural processes might have produced the whole of the biosphere. But we knew very little about the complexity that makes life possible, the integrated complexity and the informational complexity. And so during the 1950s, there were a number of discoveries made, now under the banner of the molecular biological revolution, that revealed not only that life was incredibly complex at a molecular level, but it was an integrated and informational complexity that is reminiscent of our own high-tech information technology, our own high-tech digital world. Here's the story. 1953, Watson and Crick elucidate the structure of the DNA molecule. in 57, 58, Crick advances something called the sequence hypothesis, which suggests that the chemical subunits along the interior of the twisting helix are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text or digital characters in a section of machine code or software. That is to say that these bases, or nucleotide bases as they were called, do not allow DNA to perform a function in virtue of their physical properties, but rather they allow the DNA to perform a communication function in view of their specific arrangement. And what DNA contains, therefore, are a set of instructions for building proteins and protein machines. And so what is discovered is literally a form of digital or alphabetic information, digital code, as Leroy Hood calls it. Right. Bill Gates in Seattle here calls it, says that DNA contains a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. Dawkins himself has acknowledged that the DNA contains machine code. And so that is a stop press moment in the history of biology. That when we get to the secret of life, it turns out that in addition to matter and energy, there's a third fundamental element in nature, and that is information, and it's critical. And we now know where the information is stored. We know what it does, but the discoveries of the molecular biological revolution raised a huge question, which is where did the information come from? And in my first book, Signature in the Cell, I evaluate the competing explanations and proposals that have been made to explain the origin of the information necessary to produce the first life. And I show, for reasons that are actually widely accepted by origin of life researchers themselves, that none of these proposals work. There's a kind of phenomenon going on in origin of life research where everyone recognizes that everybody else's proposal doesn't work, but they're sometimes reluctant to acknowledge it about their own. I show that neither theory is based on chance, based on natural law, or the combination of the two do an adequate job of explaining the origin of information. And yet we know of a cause that produces functional digital information, and that cause is intelligence. If we see a computer program, we know that it was produced by a programmer. In fact, whenever we see information, whether it's in a computer program or a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or in a radio signal, whenever we find information and trace it back to its ultimate source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. So I've argued in both Darwin's Doubt and subsequently in Signature in the Cell and subsequently in Darwin's Doubt that the information necessary to build the first life and then subsequent major innovations in the history of life both point to the activity of designing intelligence in the history and origin of life on this planet.
There's a kind of parallel here between the design critique of materialistic explanations for the universe and the design critique of materialistic explanations for life, where you're kind of getting behind the main theory and saying, well, look, there's this huge question that you haven't answered. So with material explanations for the universe, where did the universe come from? Material explanations for life, where did information in the first cell come from? Because, Darwin doesn't address that. He assumes a living cell and then starts with the process
in evolutionary biology, one of the things I show in Darwin's Doubt is that Neo-Darwinism does a very poor job of accounting for the information necessary to produce major innovations in the history of life, because mutations degrade information. They do not generate new information. And anyone who's done programming knows that if you've got a computer program and you allow corruption in your data or in your program, you get a series of random changes to the zeros and ones, you're going to degrade that software program long before you'll produce a new functional program or operating system. So Neo-Darwinism does a poor job of explaining the origin of information. But the newer evolutionary models that are being proposed to address this problem of the origin of major innovation in the history of life either do not address the informational requirements for producing fundamentally new forms of life, or else they presuppose prior unexplained sources of information. And I've seen this pattern repeat over and over again, where you just push the problem out of you or back one generation and don't actually explain the origin of information, just as the multiverse doesn't explain the origin of the fine-tuning. Both fine-tuning and information in the functional sense that we find with digital code, do not have any known explanation or cause other than intelligence. And so the attempt to explain these, either people ignore the problem or they simply push it back without ultimately solving it.
The picture that emerges here it's kind of optimistic. It's like the kind of gerrymandering that you saw with Einstein is happening right before our eyes with these other materialistic claims. And it looks almost as if science is turning back in the direction of theism, and there's a lot of resistance being put up to it. But in the future, perhaps we could live in an environment where, scientifically, we're more open to theism as a valid explanation for all three of these discoveries.
I think that's beginning to happen, but there's, as you correctly point out, tremendous resistance to a theistic perspective. And so when I argue that the God hypothesis is returning, I think that is the case among some scientists, but I think it's returning because of the evidence. The evidence is crying out for a God hypothesis. But one very gratifying thing for me was, as I sent the book out for review and potential endorsement, I got a surprising flood of endorsements from very high-powered scientists holding endowed chairs in various fields, chemistry, physics, biology, even a Nobel laureate in physics. So there's a lot more sympathy to these ideas out there than people realize. And I think we've had these very powerful voices in the culture, the new atheists in particular, Bill Nye, the science guy, Neil deGrasse Tyson, people who are effectively functioning as self-appointed spokespersons for science, telling us two things. One, that science and Christianity have always been at war. Science and theism have been at war, which is historically simply false. And secondly, that science properly understood today renders materialism or atheism the best overall explanatory framework for doing science. And I think that too is incorrect. That the three discoveries we've been discussing show that, that there isn't a good materialistic explanation for the origin of the universe. Let's just be clear, stipulate that. The fine tuning is not well explained by the multiverse. The multiverse still has a fine tuning problem, and no one, even people working within origin of life research recognize and will say publicly that we do not have anything like an adequate explanation for the origin of life on the basis of purely chemical evolutionary processes. So materialism has these huge explanatory gaps, but they're not just gaps. They're the evidence that has created the problems for materialism is exactly the kind of evidence that we would, in any other realm of experience, attribute to the activity of a mind, information, fine-tuning, etc.
Well, if there's a helm of the intelligent design movement, you're pretty darn close to it. And, it makes me want to ask, where do you see the intelligent design movement itself in light of this sort of shift that you're beginning to see happen in science? Because there's still a lot of stigma and resistance. I posted a while back an excerpt from your Wikipedia page where it's obvious the person who wrote it just wanted to absolutely discredit you. It's a pseudoscientific creationist. Right out of the gate, they don't even cite your PhD. It's just Stephen Meyer is a writer, a pseudoscientific writer. Where do you see the intelligent design movement, and is it gaining an acceptance?
I think we're gaining, there's a tremendous expansion in the interest in this idea. And so I think, that's gaining acceptance. And there have been some high-level scientific conversions from a Darwinian perspective to an ID perspective in recent years. So that's pretty exciting. But also as a research program, it's moving in a very fruitful and exciting direction. In the first 20 years or so of work on intelligent design, the main writers, Michael Behe, William Dembski, and me, were making arguments for intelligent design based on already known facts. What we're now seeing is that we have scientists taking the ID concept and using it to generate predictions, and then using it as a guide to discovery and predictions that are testable in the laboratory. And so an obvious example of this is the whole discussion of non-coding or so-called junk DNA. The neo-Darwinists, upon the discovery that 97% of the genome was not coding for proteins, assumed that that portion of the genome had performed no function, and therefore they labeled it junk. And it's what they would have expected given the random trial and error nature of the Darwinian mechanism. But we instead, many of our prime movers in the ID movement said, well, we accept that mutations are real processes, therefore we'd expect some degradation of an original signal, but we wouldn't expect the informational signal to be so dwarfed by the noise. So we predict and expect that the non-coding region of the DNA will be importantly functional. And when the ENCODE project was published several years ago, showing that the vast majority of the non-coding regions were in fact functional, and that overall they're functioning something like an operating system in a computer, which is controlling the timing and expression of the data files, James Shapiro, who had written some of the early articles about announcing discoveries of a function in junk DNA, openly acknowledged Richard Sternberg. He said, though he and I have different evolutionary philosophies, Sternberg being a proponent of intelligent design, he said much of the credit for the insight that the non-coding DNA would have function goes to Sternberg. He was the first guy writing on this and exposing this. So intelligent design has begun to bear fruit as not just an explanatory framework for facts we already have, but as a guide to further research that's helping us make discoveries. Because after all, if life is the product of a designing intelligence, it ought to look differently in some ways than if it was produced by an undirected, unguided process that had to produce everything in a gradual Darwinian manner. And so there are discriminating predictions that the two models make, and that allows us to do science from an ID perspective that could lead to discoveries more quickly or lead us to discover things that wouldn't have been discovered on a strictly Darwinian approach to doing the science.
Man, that's exciting. I hope I live to see some of this revolution unfold in science and for the God hypothesis to gain acceptance again, like it was at the beginning of the scientific revolution.
Yeah, well, thank you, Shane. I think it is an exciting time. And, I mentioned a couple of these high profile scientists who have recently embraced intelligent design. One is a high-powered German paleontologist, Gunther Beckley, who was one of the lead curators at Natural History Museum in Stuttgart, Germany, PhD in paleontology from Tübingen, multiple peer-reviewed publications. He was, by the way, you mentioned Wikipedia. He was described as a very prominent and accomplished paleontology on a Wikipedia page until he announced his support for intelligent design, and then Wikipedia canceled him. He's no longer on Wikipedia. I wish they'd cancel my page because, as you mentioned,
right.
Before I was for a long time, Wikipedia had me as an American theologian, but I have no degrees in theology, only physics, geology, and the philosophy of science. But, I'd like to have time to get a degree in theology, but I've never done it. Then they changed to describing me as a pseudoscientist. So maybe that's closer. I don't know. We'll see.
You just don't compute.
Yes, exactly. But the point is there are a number of people like Professor Dr. Beckley who are seeing the evidence for design and embracing it. And there's a worldwide network now of highly accomplished scientists. And one of the things we're doing at Discovery Institute is actually funding scientific research projects at mainstream secular research university with senior professors who are friendly to intelligent design and are using it as a guide to their research.
You've been listening to one of my favorite episodes of Upstream with philosopher of science, Dr. Stephen Meyer, author of the outstanding book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 scientific discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream with us and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Connect with us on social media or find more resources at upstream.colsoncenter.org.